Welcome back. For those who missed part one of this two-parter, go back and watch it. And for those who've already seen it, to bring you back up to speed, we are talking about the critical importance of having a rigorous and balanced humanities. In part one, I talked about how the values that predominate in the West, far from being obvious or universal, are actually minority moral positions on a global scale. I then proceeded to introduce the most pivotal event in human history, the agricultural revolution, and showed how it had the dangerous effect of killing off life-serving wisdom whose roots went all the way back to the dawn of life itself. I argued that this is dangerous because it occurred in pre-literate times. As such, if you kill the holder of the wisdom, you kill the wisdom. They didn't write it down. It's particularly dangerous, though, because the thing that the long-standing, long-tested wisdom was replaced with was neither long-standing nor long-tested. It was brand new. As such, it was like our ancestors were walking in a dark forest without leaving a bread trail. If things were to go sideways for them, they wouldn't be able to find their way back. Catch up complete. Let's talk about slavery. Because of how laborious farming was and how large and well-armed these tribes were becoming, suddenly there was a market for slavery. Before agriculture, the costs and benefits of keeping slaves would rarely justify it, but agriculture required large amounts of work within confined spaces. So you chain your slaves up to their workstations, make their life and livelihood contingent upon their production, and have them constantly supervised by armed guards, and slavery is born. Next, as tribes became too populous for people to keep track of each other, and as labor became more specialized, bartering would become increasingly impractical, creating the need for currency. Early on, precious metals were used because they were compact, dense stores of relatively quantifiable value. Thereafter, people began storing their precious metals in rudimentary banks, who would issue them receipts of deposit, and people would trade these receipts for goods and services. Money is born. As you can see, while the West has long engaged in all the above, none of this stuff is Western created. Agriculture was first developed by tribes in the Middle East about 12,000 years ago, and then again in Asia 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. The first known coin minting site was launched in China around 640 BC, and slavery was practiced in both of these geographic regions. It wasn't until thousands of years later that the British launched capitalism as a more efficient replacement for feudalism, which itself was a watered-down slavery. In her paper, Davis rightfully pointed out how capitalist enterprises can and regularly do disrupt, damage, or destroy human and non-human ecosystems. Furthermore, when they harm or destroy human ecosystems, it tends to be those of more vulnerable people. To the extent that capitalism isn't regulated in order to defend ecosystems and people, such destruction can be all but inevitable. If a business owner has the opportunity to gain a competitive advantage over other businesses at the expense of harming some defenseless neighbor, for example, and they don't do it, one of their competitors just might. Then the business owner potentially loses their business while the bad things end up happening anyway. And all of the business owners know this, and each of them knows that each of the others also know it. What is more, if the companies are publicly traded, so long as the harm that they could potentially do is legal, the CEOs could actually be required to enact the harm. These are not healthy incentives. So for all the positives of capitalism that Davis leaves unstated, there are obviously serious negatives that Davis did point out. Having said that, another thing that Davis did not point out was that English capitalism was not the root cause of any of this. That crown belongs to the agricultural revolution of the Middle East, which predated prehistoric Europe by thousands of years. Capitalism merely took what agriculture gave us and put it on industrial, factory-produced steroids. Today, essentially every person alive is dependent upon agriculture. Remaining hunter-gatherers collectively make up a rounding error of the global human population. Worldviews separating and elevating humanity above the rest of the community of life are just as at home in North Korea as they are in North Vancouver. The near total ubiquity of this set of theory and praxis creates a powerful illusion. When scientists are trying to figure out if something is primarily innate or primarily learned, one major indicator of nativism is that the thing is cross-culturally universal, kind of like agriculture. So for all of our differences, be we American, Kenyan, North Korean, Chinese, or Indian, we all live as if humans are special and that the world is ours to master. Powerful illusion. It's not an accident that the stories of creation, the fall, and Cain and Abel have been dated back to the same place and period as the birth of agriculture. Agriculture wasn't just a way to grow apples. It was a reordering of how we lived, how we viewed ourselves, and how we viewed ourselves in relation to the world around us. This wasn't just an agricultural revolution. It was a full-blown philosophical and theological revolution. Furthermore, many of our struggles as individuals and collectives, even today, are rooted at least partially in the consequences of this revolution. Davis says similar, though she localizes the cause to straight, white, individualist, capitalist, rationalist, able-bodied male supremacy. While I think she's overloading the identitarianism and ignoring more distal counter-narrative considerations, there is truth to what she's saying. By all appearances, prior to the agricultural revolution, the concept of enduring property was a foreign one. With everybody being nomadic and there only being so much that a nomad can carry with them as they relocate, any concept of property would be inherently temporary. Secondary to the agricultural revolution, though, we adopted a new concept, that of enduring property rights, full stop. This is a revolutionary change of mind. A revolutionary change of mind that has the consequence of squeezing out other ways of living. Earlier I asked, how, if we downgrade science and reason to the level of everything else, how do we avoid the conclusion that a belief is just as valid as any other belief because somebody believes it? Part of the problem of our large-scale, highly integrated societies is that there is a need to ascertain the relative validity of different beliefs when they come into conflict. But what if one way of living hadn't taken over the entire world? What if we didn't so often need to come to terms with people whose worldviews are different from ours because they lived in their tribes and we lived in ours, and we just for the most part stayed out of each other's way? Now, yes, there will obviously be disagreements within small family-based tribes, but at least in those cases, the leaders and the led care about each other, know each other very well, they share the same living space, and the followers can actually confront the leaders. It's not like they're average Joes in Wyoming who can't get a hold of Joe Biden in the palatial White House. And of course, tribes will sometimes need to work out agreements or settlements with other tribes when, for example, they both need access to the same river. But in the world as it is now, what if there was a tribe that wanted to continue living a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but the post-agriculturalists have claimed ownership of the hunting and foraging grounds? They get squeezed out by people who genuinely believe, or at least act as if they believe, their way of life is the only valid way to live. And none of this is to pretend that life was paradise before agriculture. Tribes fought, they were vulnerable to nature in ways that we are not, and they died of things that medical science conquered a long time ago. But returning, when Davis and others talk about not prioritizing rationality or science above other ways of knowing, I think they would be better off saying something along the lines of, let's stop assuming that our way of living, as opposed to way of knowing, is better than every other way of living, and then using this belief to justify imposing our way of living on everyone else so that we can gain access to their markets and resources. Having said all of this, there are far too many people to feed for us to abandon the high yields of agriculture. And even if it were theoretically possible to live without mass-scale agriculture, almost none of us would have the skills needed to pull it off, nor would most of us want to. But that doesn't make spreading awareness of all of this any less important. Any evolutionary biologist will tell you that if you want to know how to enable an organism to flourish, you need to know the ecosystem that it evolved within. They will also say that to the extent that their current environment diverges from that to which they are adapted or evolved, their ability to survive and thrive will generally decline. The list of problems that we are facing today is long. Mental health and addiction issues, obesity, political corruption, military armament capable of destroying the planet many times over, environmental degradation, and so on and on and on. It would be silly for us to not keep in mind our small-scale tribal evolutionary heritage when attempting to make sense of these problems and trying to figure out how to address them. This is where humanities scholars can have important voices, and this is why we need them. While I'm critical of the lack of balance in the professor's paper, I can understand where it came from. Firstly, there's a powerful, minimally contested market for exactly this kind of imbalance within academia and left-of-center politics. That's the problem. On top of this, Davis is a Black person in America. While I criticized her for pinning things born of the agricultural revolution on Western Europeans, from an Afrocentric perspective, the confusion is actually quite understandable. It is true that agriculture and not capitalism or white Europeans made slavery viable in the first place. And it's true that agriculture and slavery had been practiced in Africa for thousands of years prior to the arrival of Western Europeans. But these facts notwithstanding, several things made the white European colonizers stand out. Firstly, they were racial, linguistic, and cultural outsiders from a foreign land who were completely upending life in Africa. They were monstrous agents of chaos. These weren't the native Black slave-driving devils that they knew, and the devil that you don't know is often much scarier than the devil that you do. And even if the white colonizers didn't do what they did, Black Africans would still have had extra reason to be fearful and hostile towards them simply because they were clearly not kin. Indeed, one of the benefits of our highly integrated society is that our social structures have allowed us to significantly work around our evolved tendency to be extra skeptical toward people who don't look like us. Second, the colonizers collaborated with and bolstered African slavers, making things that much more hopeless for the slaves. Third, the white colonialists created the historical pathway that we are still on now, and that would run roughshod on Africans for generations, having legacy effects that persist to this day. While I would probably disagree with Ms. Davis as to the degree of the legacy effects and how best to address them, she's obviously not talking about nothing. Fourth, at the levels of individuals, communities, tribes, and nations, Black people have often found themselves in highly disadvantageous positions within capitalist frameworks. While there can be healthy discussion on the role of personal responsibility among Black people today when it comes to improving their standing and living conditions, as you go back in time, the further back you go, the more ludicrous that becomes. At the level of basic empathy then, and the more modest intellectual standards that we would apply to a lay individual, the conflation of the consequences of the distal cause, the agricultural revolution, with the more proximal causal agent, capitalism, absolutely makes sense. However, I maintain that the prestige and trust that we vest in professors calls for a higher standard, hence my criticism. But also, hence my position that the humanities will never not be extremely important, and so we need to keep them rigorous and balanced. That wraps up this glass half full review of Davis's paper. In the coming weeks, I hope to do a recorded conversation with someone who has been both critical and sympathetic to my takes on Davis to see what he can add to these considerations. In an online informational ecosystem, one-sided, anger-stoking content is all the rage. If you are tired of the toxic polarization and would like to see more intentionally balanced, constructive consideration of contentious issues like I'm attempting to offer, you can cast your supportive vote by liking, subscribing, and sharing, and then going out and buying yourself something nice. Thanks, and I will hopefully see you next time.